Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to MythVision. I have Dr. Ilkka Lindstedt joining me today again. Welcome back, my friend.
Thank you very much. Good to be back. I'm very happy to be here.
Thank you. I am too. For those who don't know, he has a book, Muhammad and His Followers in Context, The Religious Map of Late Antiquity Arabia. It is an academic book, so if you're really wanting to wrap your head around where the scholars are today pertaining to these issues, you can go to the Brill link that is in the description. And also, he has an academia page, and you can go and follow him, check out his latest, greatest of what he's publishing and stuff there on academia. Is there anything you want to mention about these two websites before we move into discussing some of the content that I think is going to shock our viewers?
Yeah, thanks. Last time that we spoke, I think the book had just come out and it wasn't open access, but now it's open access, so anybody can go online and download it. So it's free. If you want to buy it as a book, it's expensive, but PDF is free. So there's that.
Get it on PDF or get the hardback if you got the money. And of course, follow him for true salvation. Anyway, thank you so much, Dr. Lindstedt. I really appreciate you joining us here. You have a presentation. You told me, I reached out to you, we're friends, and I contacted you. I said, Dr. Lindstedt, like, you really shocked me with this idea that monotheism had permeated Arabia. Let's just use the term Arabia for simple terms. Like, one God theology was just saturated for centuries prior to the origins of Islam. And for me, it fascinates me because the same could kind of be said about early Christianity. And I did this a lot in our last interview. I was like, oh yeah, but the Christians did this. Oh, well, that's something that I saw in Christianity. For example, the sleepers in the cave, the sleepers of Ephesus. Well, they go to sleep and they come out and the world is like pagan when they go to bed, but then they wake up and they come out and the world's all converted to Christianity now, which it's folklore or legend. It's mythic. It's clearly not literal history. At the same time, they borrowed that from an earlier Greco-Roman sleeper in a cave motif. Long story short, I look at this monotheism thing and I think to myself, if on the ground the facts are that there was real monotheism and that was like most everything in Arabia, then why is the story saying that it was all sorts of paganism and all sorts of polytheist and stuff? It seems like that's a purposeful invention, like what the Christians did when they told wonderful stories about how their theology and their teachers changed the world. Yeah. And it's not a gotcha or I'm just lying. It's a clever way to tell of society. Like American history, we come over, the patriarchs, the fathers come over, and then they tell a mythic story about how America was invented or something. No one's supposed to take it literal, but I feel like that's going to be something we're kind of going to tap into today in a way.
Yeah, one of the topics, definitely. I mean, there in all of these traditions, Judaism, Christianity, Islam, I'm sure Zoroastrianism as well, there is this tendency to portray what was before in very distinct way from what happened after. So there's this tendency. And so even though they are using, to take the example of Islamic history, even though the Muslim scholars, they're using like real Arabian deities, they're mentioning them, and claiming that on the eve of Islam, there were still a number of people, the majority of Arabians, who worship these idols. I mean, they are using local knowledge, but it's just something that, in the case of Islamic history at least, was already dying. It was already going out, this, tradition of polytheistic beliefs and idol worshipping. And in the centuries prior to Islam, we have Judaism, Christianity spreading fast, especially Christianity in the 5th and 6th century, spreading really rapidly, it seems, in various parts of the Arabian Peninsula.
And that's what we also see even with the Roman world prior to Christianity, there was polytheism, but among the philosophers, they were growing to become very one deity minded philosophically.
Yeah.
There's a lot of that. And so I think that, again, it is kind of an error to act like everyone is just polytheistic and we're the only ones who are one God. And then, no. There's a lot more going on. So you're going to give us a presentation and we're going to bounce back and forth between bringing the visuals up and talking to you. I might have questions if that's okay with you along the way to clarify. Awesome.
Sure. Yeah.
Well, I think we should get the party started then.
Good.
Okay, let's go ahead and slideshow, play from start.
So basically I selected 4 topics that we're going to discuss, tackle, basically deconstruct, and they are 4 basically myths. And I mean, these are myths that arise in pre-modern classical Arabic literature, but they are oftentimes repeated in modern scholarly literature as well. So they are long-standing myths, we might say, and but recent research in these issues has really called into question all of these 4 myths, and we could add more, but 4 is enough. So can I get the next slide, please?
Yeah, absolutely.
Sure. So first up is prevalence of idolatry, and this is something that we discussed last time when I was here, and just recently. And the second topic is Kaaba, the importance of that shrine in pre-Islamic times. Then we go on to ethics and sort of cultural stuff. Can I discuss infanticide? There's a very common myth nowadays still that in particular female infanticide was a very common occurrence in pre-Islamic Arabia. We're gonna look at that. And then related to number 3 is number 4, which is just all around lawlessness in Arabia. This idea that there was constant warfare, intertribal warfare to be more exact, that was going on in pre-Islamic Arabia. And then when Islam comes, then it's all happiness and peacefulness after that. So we're gonna tackle these one by one.
There's
like
your book.
like mentioned at the beginning by Derek, the book is now open access. So and it addresses some of these issues, not all of them, but some of them.
Go check it out.
Yeah.
Oh, sorry.
All right, idolatry. So let's have the first quote, and this is by Ibn Hisham. Hisham Ibn al-Kalbi, who wrote a book called Kitab al-Asnam, or the Book of Idols. And the book was not that important in the medieval era. I think it survives in quite few manuscripts today, but its ideas are sort of representative of the common Muslim scholarly view among the scholarly elite, at least, of what was happening in pre-Islamic Arabia. And the book is called The Book of Idols, Kitab al-Asnam. And the portrayal that it puts forward is that on the eve of Islam, still when the Prophet Muhammad was active, these different tribes in Arabia, these different towns in various localities in Arabia, they all had their sort of patron deity or deities, idols, often stones or trees, sacred trees that were worshipped by the people living there. And it doesn't really mention that anybody was Jewish or Christian at the time, even though from inscriptions we actually know that they were. But so this is an example from the book. Hisham is saying that the pre-Islamic Arabs were widely known for this idea of idol worship, and they would erect stones, and then they would worship the stones or circumambulate the stones like a temple. and these stones were idols. And this is very much echoed in still modern scholarship, even though many scholars, including myself, have called this into question. One example is Michael Cook's recent book, A History of the Muslim World. It came out last year, 2024. And can I get the quotation? Cook says that there were 360 idols around the Kaaba. And this is a figure that directly comes from classical Arabic literature, such as the book by Hisham ibn al-Kalbi. And Cook emphasized that the abiding core of Arab paganism was idol worship. And elsewhere he says that, most Arabs were actually pagan.
So just so we're on the same page, Cook recently is still going with the same idea.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. And I mean, that is a book that is probably, will be widely read, is widely read at the moment. So it will have an effect how, the students, for instance, studying Islamic studies in various universities will learn about this history. So it's a myth that still exists and is echoed by established, esteemed scholars such as Michael Cook.
Got it. Thank you.
And the funny thing, or the interesting thing, is that we actually have this sort of, idol stones mentioned in epigraphy. So this is a stone with writing on it, Nabatean Aramaic writing on it. This is from northwest South Arabia. Most of the epigraphic stuff which we're going to look at are from that region, which is to say northern Hijaz, that Tabor region, so north of Medina, but still in the Hijaz. And we have these inscriptions that mention deities that are somehow represented by these stones. I mean, this inscription says that this is a lot which was made by somebody called Ghanim or Ghanm, etc. So somehow the engraver thought or wanted to portray this stone as representing the deity, right? Deity Allah. It's a deity that is mentioned in the Quran also.
If I may about this, there's a scholar, Robert Cargill, who wrote a book called Cities That Built the Bible. The entire premise of the book is to suggest that the stories that we read about in the Bible are reflective of the geography on the ground. So anyone 1,000 years, let's just say something happened, let's say 300 of the Common Era, they wrote on the stone, let's just say, or 400 of the Common Era, or 500, whatever. Someone in the 7th century Arabia could easily read this or see this and then craft a story about what they see on the rocks, what they see around them. And it doesn't necessarily mean there's this practice still happening in the 7th century, but it's on the stone right here. So like Sodom and Gomorrah, the famous story that gets destroyed by fire, and Lot's wife turning into a pillar of salt. What they do is you go to the Dead Sea, you could see pillars of salt everywhere, and they create a story based on the things that are geographically in the region. And it makes me wonder if some of these stones with the names of Allah and other goddesses or gods on rocks are just centuries later, they're writing stories looking at these rocks and seeing it. You know what I mean?
Yeah. I mean, that's possible in some cases, but not in this one, because so this is in Nabatean Aramaic, paleographically difficult to date, but maybe 1st century Common Era. And people living in the 6th or 7th century Arabia couldn't read this anymore. I mean, the Nabatean script was evolving fast in antiquity and late antiquity, and it becomes what is later known as the Arabic script. And the in the 6th century, people could maybe then read, 5th century inscriptions, but they did not have knowledge of this Nabatean script of antiquity. So this stone, this very stone, a person living in the 6th or 7th century couldn't, in all likelihood, have read, but they probably had the knowledge of Allah as a deity that was worshipped, probably some centuries after the 1st century. I mean, like I mentioned here, there are inscriptions up to the 4th century Common Era evidencing polytheism or idolatry and, worship of deities such as Allah. So then in oral tradition, or maybe in actual practice, the knowledge or memory of Allah worship still existed in the 6th and 7th century. That's likely. And I think that there were probably some people who still worshipped these old pagan deities, so-called pagan deities. I mean, if you think about how, for instance, Christianity spread in various places, such as Finland, for instance, where I'm from, I mean, these pagan practices and pagan deities still continue to be in some sort of existence up to I think, around the 18th century or 19th century even though Christianity came to Finland in the 13th century.
Right.
And spread quite fast, I suppose. So people started to identify as Christian and went to churches to worship, but they still had the knowledge and in some places also the actual practice of these old pagan deities or worshiping these old pagan deities, right?
Gotcha.
But what happens already in the 1st century Common Era, if not before, we have the arrival of Jews and Judaism in North Arabia. And this is our first dated inscription is, if I remember correctly, from 42 Common Era. It's not this one, it's another one. It's a grave inscription from Hegra, if memory serves me right. And it mentions a burial of a Jewish person, right, and his wife, I believe, and maybe his children are also to be buried in that grave. And this is before the destruction of the Second Temple of Jerusalem. And because I'm mentioning this because quite often people connect the destruction of the Second Temple and the arrival of Jews in Arabia. But actually there were some Jews arriving even earlier in Northern Arabia. So we have so the spread of Judaism is due to two factors, probably migration and then conversion to Judaism. And conversion happens in various places. It would seem also in the south as well. Difficult to really grasp how large phenomena we are talking about here, whether it was mostly due to migration or to conversion, but probably both happened. And so this example is an interesting inscription, quite much later than the one that I showed in the previous slide. So this is we can still call it a Nabatean inscription, but the script is becoming more and more Arabic-like. And, in 200 years, it is the Arabic script. So it continues to evolve. Interestingly, also, there are 3 lines in Aramaic in this inscription, so the first 3 months. And then there are 3 lines in Arabic. So it's a mixture of these 2 different languages. I mean, this happens in Nabatean Aramaic inscriptions. So you have Arabic there, a word here and another there. But I mean, in this inscription, the extent of penetration of Arabic is quite, it's extensive. And it probably shows that the person writing this was called something like Shulai, son of Aus. He probably spoke Arabic, but he also knew Aramaic as a written language, could read and write Aramaic as well. So, and more interestingly even is that he is mentioning a Jewish feast, the feast of the unleavened bread, right? Hajj al-Fatir. And that name of the feast is written in Arabic, not Aramaic, but Arabic. And it's a Jewish feast. It's probable that this person, Shulai, also was Jewish because he mentions this feast. Even if he is not Jewish himself, I mean, it's interesting and important that he mentions this feast, and he mentions it in Arabic. So there were Arabic-speaking Jews around, and this is once again from northern Hijaz, Arabic-speaking Jews around 300 years before the Prophet Muhammad's mission in Mecca and Medina. So quite interesting stuff here. And by the way, these inscriptions are dated according to the era of the Roman province of Arabia. And this era started in 106 Common Era. In case you're wondering, why do these, they text mentions one date, and then there's in, parentheses, there's another date, which is the Common Era date, 303. And quite helpfully, this guy also mentioned the exact date, so we know exactly when this was written. So Judaism, comes very early, and then it starts to spread in various places in Arabia. Then we have Christianity appearing in Arabia. So I'm going to show a few examples of that. This is from near Najran in southern Arabia. This is from the southernmost parts of today's Saudi Arabia, right? And it has a huge cross, it has a date, and then it has a name. So it doesn't tell us much, but it does tell that Christianity was already present in southern Arabia in late 5th century. And there are many more of these inscriptions from this area, which is called Hema. So this is not the only one, and many of them have crosses, so they clearly show a Christian community there already in the 5th century. And this is also important. Like I mentioned, the connection of the Second Temple, or destruction of the Second Temple in 70, and the arrival of Jews, and sort of problematized that and said actually Jews were coming earlier. So here too, I mean, there has been a quite common assumption among scholars that Christianity starts to spread in the south in the era of the Ethiopian conquests and colonialism of Yemen, which is in the 6th century, right? So early 6th century, and it goes on. The Ethiopian era goes on until 570s or thereabout. So probably during that era, I mean, Ethiopia was a Christian kingdom, right? And they probably supported Christianity, and Christianity was spreading because of their efforts too, but it had started already before that. So that's interesting. We even have, and I don't think I have it in the slides, but we now even have Syriac inscriptions from Najran, which is interesting. So Syriac is a form of Aramaic. It was used by the Church of the East and some other Middle Eastern Christian communities. And, people for a long time thought that maybe in Najran there were people speaking or writing Syriac, but now we actually have, evidence of that, which is nice as well.
Wow.
All right, and these are from the north. I mean, they are only names, or the one on the left only says Al-Hadda bar Thalaba, so Al-Hadda, the son of Thalaba, and there's a cross there. Not sure you can see, but the cross is on the right. And the one on the right, which is from southern Jordan, from near Karak in southern Jordan, I mean, it has a name, quite long lineage or genealogy for the guy, and it has a date or a year, and it has these crosses. I think I see at least 4 crosses in the inscription. And these are in Arabic. I mean, they are in Arabic script. They are in Arabic language. Even though they are very brief, of course. I mean, there's not a lot of content in these inscriptions, but they show us quite clearly that Christianity, and this is only to give a couple of examples of these Christian inscriptions in pre-Islamic Arabia. And I advise everybody to go to Ticonab. The link was in the previous slide. It's a digital database edited by Laila Neme, and many of these inscriptions have been published by her. So it's an amazing digital database of Nabatean and pre-Islamic Arabic inscriptions. So do check it out.
Check it out.
Next up, we have Kaaba.
This one's fun.
Yeah. So various scholars, I mean, of course, this is an idea that comes from the pre-modern Arabic literary evidence. For instance, I'm quoting here Al-Mas'udi. He's a 10th century Common Era author who wrote important historical work. He, for instance, mentions how important the Kaaba shrine was in pre-Islamic Arabia, suggesting that even Sasan, who's sort of the founder of the Sassanid dynasty in Iran, went to Kaaba for pilgrimage. So not only is it drawing local pilgrims and maybe, let us say, monotheist pilgrims, but it is also drawing a Zoroastrian figure, an Iranian, from the Iranian royal house to come to Kaaba and circumambulate the Kaaba and worship there. Of course, the building of Kaaba is credited to Abraham in the Quran, as is well known. We also have linkages to Adam, suggestions in Islamic tradition, suggestions that Adam was the one that brought, or maybe it was Gabriel. There are various narratives on this, that brought the black stone from the Garden of Eden, right? When Adam was banished, or Gabriel brought it at some point, and then it turned black when it came, sort of entered the earthly realm from the Garden of Eden, where it was white, right? So we have this idea in Islamic era literature of the centrality of the Kaaba shrine in pre-Islamic era, and various modern historians have sort of taken up this myth and sort of developed it further. William Montgomery Watt is one such scholar. So he, in the 20th century, in the 1950s, he wrote these very influential biographies of the Prophet Muhammad, which are still valuable today. But of course, there are aspects in them which need to be criticized, I think. One such notion in Watt's work is the centrality of the Kaaba shrine. So he had the idea that the Meccan aristocracy, well, first of all, that there was this important Meccan aristocracy, and that they had gotten rich through administering this, huge influential pilgrimage to Kaaba. And so they, maybe they were selling tickets, I don't know. Then there was trade and commerce that was linked to the pilgrimage, and they had gotten rich because of that. And the Prophet Muhammad's mission, in Watt's telling, is a reaction against that. So it's a very Marxist reading of the Prophet Muhammad's life, and there are various problematic issues with the whole biography. Not only this, but especially this aspect of the importance of Mecca and the importance of the pilgrimage to Mecca is something that more recent scholarship has definitely criticized. Patricia Krone in 1987, in a book called Meccan Trade and the Rise of Islam, noted that Mecca was probably a rather minor town, and it was not an important center for pilgrimage or trade. And Krone was reacting to both very much, and some other scholars. So I think Krone's suggestion is very, very probable, that the importance of Mecca has been exaggerated by certain scholars, and definitely exaggerated by classical Muslim scholars as well. So if we look at the various types of evidence that we might have that would mention perhaps Mecca, I mean, we have tens of thousands of inscriptions from Arabia, from pre-Islamic times, which mention different localities in Arabia. They mention Medina or Yathrib, for instance. There are at least 3 or 4 inscriptions or thereabouts that mention Medina. We don't have any inscription mentioning Mecca at all. So if Mecca were this, important center of pilgrimage and trade, you would assume that there were some inscriptions that mention Mecca, but there's not at all. Non-Arabic sources don't mention Mecca either. So, and once again, they do mention, for instance, Medina. So, which is interesting, and Medina probably was quite much bigger town in pre-Islamic times than Mecca. We have some pre-Islamic poems or Arabic poems that are ascribed to pre-Islamic figures, and there's a scholarly dispute on the authenticity of this corpus, of the poetical corpus. I think that there's reasons to suggest that much in the pre-Islamic Arabic poetical corpus is authentic, and at least some of these references to Kaaba and Mecca are also authentically pre-Islamic, even though they survive in much later collections of poetry. So we do have those, but they too are quite few in number. So we have some mentions of pilgrimage to Mecca, and it seems that the rites and customs around the Kaaba shrine differed to a certain degree from the later Islamic era ones. But people, including perhaps some Christians, were drawn to this place, the Kaaba shrine, and it in all likelihood had existed for some time, and people made the pilgrimage to that site. What is interesting in the poetry too is that they never mention any idols around the Kaaba shrine. You remember Michael Cook mentioned 360 idols, and this comes from the Islamic tradition. And all of the poets that mention some deity connected to and protecting the Kaaba shrine, it's always the one God. It's always Allah or Al-Ilah, God, or Ar-Rab, Lord. So it's always a monotheistic.
And this is you're saying the poetry even pre-Islam is still, how far back?
I mean, these are 6th century figures, and there are debate about the authenticity of individual poems and verses.
Right.
But, we have figures such as Nabigha Dubiani, a 6th century figure, Al-Asha, who was a contemporary of the Prophet Muhammad, and they mentioned the pilgrimage to Kaaba. They mention Kaaba in some way, and they always mention the one God. And it is probable, I think, at least possible, that both of these characters or these poets were actually Christian. Both Nabigha Dubiani, he is a poet who was the main sort of poet of the Ghassanids, which is Arabic-speaking dynasty in Syria, and they were Christian. They were Christian since the 5th, 6th century, and it is, I would say, it's probable that their sort of main poet was Christian as well. At least, his poetry is thoroughly monotheistic, and there are some Christian aspects in it. All right.
Oh, let me ask you one thing, since we're moving on from that, the Kaaba, just for my viewers who like to know where traditions may come from. The idea of a shrined stone in a square structure, does this have any Persian, Zoroastrian, or even some pre-Mithraic, Mithraism, genealogical mythic tradition? Because, for example, with Mithras, he was birthed from a rock, born out of a rock.
Right.
And we also have a god named Dusares, who is from the region of Arabia. It calls it Arabia, but it's also near Petra. Then there's Alexandrian Egypt with a god named Ion, and Christian writers like Epiphanius and others write about these gods and their association with stones, but specifically Mithras, I know, was born from a stone. So I don't know. I was wondering, maybe it's just a common trope. Is there anyone who's ever written that you're aware of about an earlier myth from a different tradition? Just like we talked about earlier, in Finland, Christianity comes, pagan residue still there. And even the Christians in Finland that don't honor those gods, sometimes they even have those gods convert. So in the stories of Christians, they have Zeus or Dionysus or Heracles. Yes, they become Christian too. Does the Kaaba have an earlier mythic tradition that you know of?
Yeah, I mean, it's difficult to say when our, I mean, from my perspective, I'm sure that and I know that there's quite a lot of, both popular and especially popular literature connected to the Black Stone of Kaaba. It has always sort of raised a number of questions in people's heads, right? But I mean, when it comes to sort of proper historical work, we have so little evidence on the Kaaba to begin with. We don't, like I mentioned, no inscription mentions it, either the Kaaba or Mecca in general. Non-Arabic sources are also not helpful here. So we only have these a few poems that mention plausibly from pre-Islamic times that mention the pilgrimage there and the Black Stone. I mean, and they always, it's possible, and I would deem it probable, that there is a connection to the idea that we discussed before, that a stone could somehow represent a deity, right? And this is also what you were hinting at. So that's probably there. And some mention, some Islamic era works mention that the deity worshipped at Kaaba was originally Hubal. But once again, we don't have much to work with here. We only have these very late myths or narratives about the place. But what seems clear from the poetry, supposing it is authentic, at least partly, is that Kaaba had been reinterpreted already in the 6th century in a monotheistic framework. So the poets go there, they say they worship God there, the one God there, and the one God is the protector of that place. So probably there's some sort of genealogy there when it comes to the idea of a stone representing something, but we cannot really reconstruct what was happening there at the moment, at least. Maybe, hopefully, somebody will find those inscriptions that mention the Kaaba shrine from pre-Islamic times, but we just don't have them at the moment. So we have very little to go by.
Awesome. Infanticide.
Yeah, heavy stuff, grim stuff.
Yeah, it is.
Yeah, so I mean, so this is a very common myth, especially, I mean, in pre-modern Arabic works, they sort of had this idea that infanticide in general was very common in pre-Islamic Arabia, but they also have this strand of thought that it was in particular female infanticide, which was practiced in pre-Islamic Arabia. And the idea of female infanticide, of supposed female infanticide, is what you hear quite often today in in particular in popular depictions of pre-Islamic Arabia, but also academic ones. And this is a myth that I tackle in a few publications. One that has been published in the Jigsaw, or the Journal of International Quranic Studies Association, and then there's a forthcoming piece, and I think at least some of them you can download from academia.edu, or one of them, I mean, or maybe there's an earlier draft. In any case, you can see what I think by going to academia.edu and downloading the specific article discussing this. All right, so like I mentioned, there, some mention infanticide in general, but then there are these ideas that it was especially baby girls that were killed by pre-Islamic Arabians. And this is one such quote included in various works. Here I quote Athalabi. He's, among other things, a Quranic commentator. This is from a Quranic commentary. It's the same narrative occurs here and there, and the same idea occurs here and there in Muslim scholarly literature from the pre-modern era. So here he is quoting Ibn Abbas, Abdullah ibn Abbas. He's an early Quranic commentator, very important one. He was ascribed, or to him was ascribed, a lot of material, including inauthentic material, and probably also this is one of the inauthentic narratives ascribed to him. So he says that when somebody in Jahiliyyah means the pre-Islamic era, right? The era of ignorance. This is what it means. It means ignorance, but it's the era of ignorance, which is what the Islamic era commentators, Islamic era scholars were using when discussing pre-Islamic Arabia. So by looking at that term alone, you get the idea of what sort of Arabia they were trying to portray. It was one of ignorance, right? One of horrible things, right? And this is one of the horrible things that they portray there. So, daughters were routinely and sort of culturally killed, murdered, and all the sons would then be kept. And of course, this doesn't make much sense. I mean, if you think about it, I mean, a group would go extinct in a matter of a few generations, right? If this was a common cultural occurrence that would routinely take place, as Athalabi and some other scholars suggest happened. So we have reason to be skeptical here. Of course, we should note that this is the era before modern birth control. Infanticide definitely occurred for various reasons: food crisis, poverty. In modern day, we have, in most countries, we have the safety of you get the nourishment that you need just by visiting a grocery store, right? And having at least some money to pay for that. But of course, in pre-modern era, we have various reasons why there would be very difficult times for families. They would not necessarily, if there were already many children in the family, they would not necessarily have the means to have any more. But then on the other hand, you didn't have any birth control, so it was really difficult to try to limit the number of children that a couple would have. So infanticide happened. It happened everywhere in pre-modern world. Infant abandonment is something that in the scholars of antiquity and late antiquity have found that was a rather common form of sort of under the same umbrella of topic. So in this case, you would just leave the infant somewhere, not kill it, but leave it, and somebody would, maybe pick him or her up and bring him or her up. Maybe sometimes as a slave, a servant, or some other position. If that child was lucky, of course, they would then be brought up as one of the children in the family. All right. So this is the situation everywhere. So and let me just continue with that a little bit. And so the classical Muslim sources, they basically mentioned that not only were these children killed, they were actually buried alive, and many of these narratives emphasize that it was in particular female infanticide, like I have noted. The Quranic support for this is very low, I would say. So infanticide is generally mentioned as, of course, prohibited in the Quran a few times. Female infanticide is only understood to occur in two different verses: the discussion and prohibition of female infanticide. So this is Surah 16, Surah An-Nahl, and then Surah 81, Surah Al-Takwir. Sorry. And supposedly, at least, so there are these two surahs that mention in passing female infanticide. But like I discussed in the articles, I mean, this is very problematic, I would say. Those passages are very difficult to interpret. I mean, the Surah An-Nahl 1 and Surah 16 is more straightforward when it comes to the Arabic in it. I mean, but it seems to, at least to me, I interpret it in that way that it discusses the phenomenon that I mentioned earlier, which is infant abandonment. And it only, it discusses a sort of hypothetical disbeliever as mulling about this option, not actually committing this crime of infanticide / infant abandonment. But yeah, it seems to be more about infant abandonment than infanticide. Then in Surah Al-Takwir, we have a word, al-maw'uda, which is in later traditions understood to denote a female infant buried alive. Al-maw'uda, a female infant buried alive. But in the articles, I discuss it from the point of view of Arabic and what the verb and the sort of the root vada means in general, and I conclude that it probably doesn't mean what it is usually taken to mean. So that's the argument. Also, when we look at various forms of material evidence and textual evidence from pre-Islamic Arabia, I mean, the idea of this cultural habit of female infanticide doesn't appear anywhere. Basically, we don't have any epigraphic evidence that it happened. Nobody mentions it. No non-Arabic source mentions it, which you would think that they do if it happened, because I mean, they are very keen on documenting the various odd habits of the Arabians. I mean, the Greek authors, the Latin authors, the Syriac authors. Quite often for them, Arabs or Arabians are sort of like these, not to a degree barbarians, I suppose, but like just uneducated, illiterate people. And of course, I mean, they are just sort of rehashing their own cultural tropes about the outgroup, because we know that,
stereotype.
yeah. So we just don't have any evidence, any pre-Islamic evidence for this female infanticide, and even the Quranic verses that are usually thought to refer to this cultural habit probably don't so much do that.
Question about this then: why? What is the best guess on why this exists at all? Why invent this story? Is it purely based on a myth of demonizing the pre-Islamic era, and then they invented a story? Maybe based off of the fact that a few people actually did this, but it wasn't a common practice. What do you think the best scholarly guess is to explain the origins of this horrific practice?
Right. I mean, the second article, which is still forthcoming by me on the issue, so tries to hypothesize some sort of ideas how this might have developed. And the interesting thing in these later portrayals of this habit is that they usually mention that one specific tribe committed it. And this tribe is Tamim. It's a big tribe from central and eastern Arabia. I mean, in pre-Islamic times, it was important, and in Islamic times, it was important. It was partially, it would seem, Christian, at least according to some narratives, and then they became Muslim quite soon. At least that's how it's portrayed. And interestingly, for some reason, most of these narratives talking in detail about this horrific cultural or supposed cultural practice, they say that Tamim was the tribe that actually would commit it at all, or would commit it most. So, and then naturally there are some other scholars who say that actually it was all the Arabs that did it, or or some other tribes. Kinda is also mentioned in some of these stories. And so, and what I suggest in the second article is that we can trace the development of this myth by looking at when it first appears, according to poetry in particular, which is easier to date than prose narratives. And the first occurrences of this myth come from around the year 700 Common Era that I could find in poetical collections. And interestingly, it's a Tamimi poet who says that in fact we are not the ones doing this. He's saying that actually we are the ones who prohibited the practice even in pre-Islamic times. So he seems to be reacting to some criticism of this tribe that was going on. And furthermore, I try to pinpoint that this might have something to do with the fact that Tamim, the tribe of Tamim, which was a big tribe, important Arabian tribe, was on the losing side in the second civil war, or the second fitna, as it is called, that happened in 680s and 690s. So during this era, we have two caliphs. We have the Umayyad caliphs, Umayyad Caliph in Syria. For the most of this time, it was Abdul Malik ibn Marwan, a very famous caliph who built the Dome of the Rock, for instance. And so he's in Syria. He has his court in Damascus, right? And then we have another caliph, an anti-caliph in Mecca, and he's called Abdullah ibn Zubair. And during this Second Civil War, there were also some other parties that took part, and various, a lot of fighting was going on. And at some point, it actually seemed that Ibn Zubair is going to win, because he controlled Egypt, he controlled Iraq, these really prosperous regions, the breadbaskets of the caliphate. And the Umayyad Caliph, Abdul Malik, even he only had Syria, basically. And of course, an important region, but I mean, he did not have so much power than Ibn Zubair at some point. But in the end, the Umayyads are able to defeat this anti-caliph Ibn Zubair, and they kill him, and very violently, and and his followers as well. Many of them are killed during the fighting in 690s, more specifically 692 Common Era. And even Mecca and the Kaaba shrine is damaged during the fighting, when there are Umayyad catapults that shoot rocks, and they hit also the Kaaba shrine. So it's a pretty big battle going on in various localities, and in the end the Umayyads win. And Tamim, this tribe, had sided for the most part with Ibn Zubair, the Arabian caliph, as if you will. And I mean, this Tamim was a tribe that lived in Central Arabia, in Eastern Arabia, in Southern Iraq. So those are sort of the areas where Ibn Zubair was, in control and was winning. So, of course, it's quite understandable that they supported Ibn Zubair. But, they lose. And Tamim in particular is sort of picked as one of the tribes that is then criticized a lot by other Arabs, because they sided with this losing anti-caliph. And for instance, there's a poet called Al-Akhtal, who was a Christian, by the way, but he was in the court of the Umayyad caliphs, and he composed this ode in honor of Abdul Malik ibn Marwan, who had won the Second Civil War. And the poem, addresses the fighting that was going on, and that the Umayyad Caliph was victorious. And it, there's a lot of criticism of Tamim in that poem, a lot, and very nasty stuff is said about them. Not female infanticide, I should acknowledge, so it doesn't exist in that poem. But like I mentioned, it seems to then around that time, it seems to rise as a myth that is somehow connected to this tribe. Tamim is sort of one way of criticizing that tribe that was behaving in an immoral way by siding with the enemies of the caliph.
It reminds me of modern day political propaganda in a way, but also in the same region kind of the world, with the ancient myth of the Israelites and the Canaanites, and how the Canaanites sacrificed their how they sacrificed infants, the Edomites. There's always these propaganda against the other tribes. And much of the stuff scholars think was written much later, reflecting probably skirmishes or quarrels later as they're writing their mythic history of the past. But yeah, I like the way you're thinking about this. Is like, if you're going to, it's like you get this a lot with female goddesses, females, period, like Mary. In the early church, Mary Magdalene was a very important figure.
Yeah.
And you get someone like Elaine Pagels points out, she thinks that Mary was a significant disciple of the early movement, at least in the literature. There's a Gospel of Mary that portrays her as above Peter. Now, that might be reacting to other versions of Peter being the most important, but in Luke's Gospel, Mary is said to have had 7 demons that were cast out. But
Yeah.
when you go to the Gospel of Mary, she talks about 7 powers of God that are good.
Right.
So Elaine Pagels thinks that Luke's Gospel is reacting to the Gospel of Mary about the 7 powers and making her filled with 7 demons. I guess what I'm getting at is like, this could easily be explained, like you just said, these guys sided with the wrong people, screw them. They're infant, they were sacrificing their baby girls. Let's make them look really, really bad. You know what I mean?
Yeah, that's what seems to have taken place. That's my best guess, at least.
Thank you.
Yeah. And then we have all around lawlessness. And of course, I suppose we sort of addressed this issue in the preceding a little bit, at least. I mean, and this arises from the some of the stories in classical Arabic historiographical and other collections where they discuss, and here I'm talking about especially warfare, where they discuss the battle days of Arabs, Ayyam al-Arab, the battle days of Arabs, sort of meaning the pre-Islamic Arabs, of course. And then here's an citation from Jonathan Brown's book. Muhammad is once again quite well-read book. I think it's called Muhammad, A Concise History or something like that. So he is suggesting that in the Hijaz, in pre-Islamic Hijaz, everybody is all the time on the verge of famine and death. It's interesting that he doesn't really discuss because in his telling, of course, Islam brought a lot of important things such as monotheism and morals and law. But here he is talking about geography, right? And these sort of things. So, of course, that didn't change. But in many of these portrayals of pre-Islamic Arabia, they are portraying Arabia, both modern and pre-modern portrayals. They are just ascribing all of these bad things to pre-Islamic Arabia, even without asking that, well, if some things did change, for instance, probably monotheism, spread to corners of Arabia where it hadn't spread so much before. And, Islamic law gave, at some point at least, a shared frame of reference for people living in Arabia, most of whom were, by that point, Muslim. I mean, this idea that pre-Islamic Arabia, pre-Islamic Hijaz, also including Najd, which is the central and sort of eastern parts of Arabia. I mean, the whole of Arabia is here portrayed in a very dark fashion when it comes to food also. And well, then you ask yourself, well, did Islam change anything in that respect? Of course not. I mean, you can't change geography, at least much, I suppose. And this idea of a very dry Arabia, very, food insecure Arabia, of course, it has some truth in it, but it's one of those myths that has been overemphasized, exaggerated by scholars. So, there are, well, first of all, climate has changed quite a lot in 1,500 years or so. But in addition to that, it is still possible to grow barley, for instance, in nowadays in Taif, which is a town very close to Mecca, for instance. So it is not like cultivating crops was completely impossible in all parts of Arabia. I mean, you have parts that are high up in the mountains and there's a lot of rain, then even places which are lower. Still there are parts that where there's enough rain that you can cultivate some crops, right? Okay, just wanted to mention that.
Yeah.
Okay. And how Brown continues in sentences 2 and 3 of this quotation. I mean, there's raiding by other tribes all the time, and then you have this kinship idea, which affords protection. No government, no law, only family and the tribe. So, dangerous times. And as I mentioned, so this idea of constant intertribal warfare, it seems to arise from two things in particular. Prose narratives concerning the so-called battle days of the Arabs, and then you have poetry by or attributed to pre-Islamic Arabic poets that have the feature of warfare and bravery very much in them. That's a constant feature in some poets' work. But here you have to be critical, right? I mean, the battle days of the Arabs narratives, they are much later. They are we cannot really, in most cases, we cannot really ascertain them that they really narrate some battles that took place. Rather, many of them seem to be, or at least include a lot of literary embellishment in them. Then about these poets and their poetry. I mean, much of it, as I said, can be authentic, but they are very much boasting about their bravery and supposed deeds. And not all of these poets are like that. There are also poets who, criticize, bloodshedding and say that it would be nice that if everybody just lived in peace. But those poets that are constantly or to a large degree telling about their heroic feats, I think they should be understood like today's gangster rappers. So, take it with a grain of salt, what they write. I don't think that everything that they say really took place. And then all of the supposed evidence that we have about this constant warfare in pre-Islamic Arabia starts to crumble, right? There's not much of it. And like I told in the preceding, I mean, in the last point about the second fitna, for instance, this was a period. So this is in Islamic era, and people fighting each other as, for the most part, at least, they are Muslim, right? So it's Muslim versus Muslim warfare. It is happening within and without Arabia. Very important battles happening in Arabia. So it's not like, Islam ended warfare in Arabia or elsewhere. So that's not the case at all.
That's a great point.
No.
And it's still happening today, even. I mean, everyone, everywhere. Christians fight Christians, you know what I mean? Like, it never ends.
No. And this point in the last sentence of this quotation, that there's no government or law, that can be also problematized, I suppose. I mean, what we don't have on the eve of Islam, during the life of Prophet Muhammad, sort of large states are missing in Arabia. That is definitely the case. So there had been some states before, of course. We have in ancient Arabia, we have the, important states in Daran, for instance, or some other regions. We have in Yemen, we have important sort of not Arabia wide, but sort of quite expansive states that provided some sort of law and I suppose security to their denizens. But what we do have during the life of the Prophet Muhammad, we have various city-states. So it seems that states, cities such as, or towns such as Medina had a leader, and there was some sort of rules and regulations and some sort of law that was taking place. Also, if you take into account the fact that many people in Arabia were Jews and Christians, of course they had their own ideas about ethics and law that at least partially came from their own religious tradition and partially from their cultural environment, but that definitely existed. So it's not like there was no ethical discourse at all in Arabia. There certainly was that. There was also government and law in some places. Pacey Brown, and I suppose that's where the PowerPoint ends.
Perfect. Okay, let me have a little short conversation with you, my friend. So I love the final point, because a common myth is still being circulated by modern authors. And it's not just dealing with Islam. That's why I'm so fascinated by interviewing scholars such as yourself, because I'm so Bible orientated, and so Judaism, Christianity, and really ancient Near East, way before Islam, that when I hear you say certain things, I see patterns, and they're not always connected. Obviously, most of them aren't connected genetically, but it's a human motif that you find, a pattern that seems to be repeated, and you don't need to tell someone for them to do it. It's normal. Your point about no government, no law, only tribe, only kinsman. I could see that's a bit exaggerative to push up the idea that when Islam came, we have a massive universal law, universal umbrella. It's no longer this tribe versus this tribe, Mecca versus Medina. It's one giant family now in one God, right? But you hear this with there's a author, Tom Holland, talking about Christianity, and he really loves pushing the agenda that before Christianity, chaos, debauchery, orgies, murder, the pagans were just evil, bad people. Christianity, good, everyone else bad. And it's no, they may have done really good in the philosophy of Christianity. They do systematize the ethics. They systematize the ethics in a good way that everyone from the elite to the slave can have a form of philosophy under one umbrella. But it was definitely a well-known ethical thing prior to Christianity, that people behaved this way. So it just seems like a myth. Like you said, they're exaggerating, and maybe there are occurrences where certain non-Christians behave certain ways, but it isn't common practice. It's every once in a while you might find here or there some practices that are still archaic, still backwards.
Yeah, I mean, especially the myth of infanticide. I mean, as you mentioned, it's there in the Hebrew Bible already. I mean, that's something that is very often attributed to the outgroup, to the other, and the pagans especially. The Hebrew Bible does this. I suppose maybe the New Testament, at least Christian authors do it. Later Christian authors, and then also Muslim scholars do it then later, and the Quran to a degree as well does this portrayal of the pagans as killing their own children. But like I mentioned, this should be very critically assessed, approached and assessed, and discussed in tandem with other types of evidence to see if that really happened at all. And it's not like any of these traditions actually end these crimes, these occurrences of various bad deeds. So they still exist within those faith traditions, right?
Right. So to make your point clear, they're still fighting. Tribes are still fighting when Islam rises.
Yeah.
There's still people probably infanticide. I mean, there's going to be that in every society, right? There's places where I imagine even in Islamic regions where they behave unethically, sexually immoral, you name it. Just because Christianity showed up did not mean people stopped behaving a certain way. And the same goes for Islam, and the same goes for Judaism or any religion. That's the myth that they're selling you, is that we have the true light. This is the true message. And you have to take that very carefully. And I try to do a little bit of, think like Socrates, ask questions, skeptical questions. Like if I bring up, Christianity to a Muslim, if I say, hey, to the Muslim, my friend, Christianity brought all this light to the world. But I added that they're Trinitarian Christians. Oh, hold on. No. Jesus was a Muslim, and so now you have to go down that path. But if you try to tell them, no, Trinitarian belief is what brought good, they go, no, that's polytheism, and they don't accept. The same goes for Christians. You start telling them, well, Islam brought this. They don't accept. Notice it's tribal. My beliefs.
Yeah, and I mean also this between these various monotheistic traditions, you have the blaming of the other falling short of monotheism, like you just described. I mean, there's quite a lot of discussion in classical Muslim scholarship if the Jews and Christians of their time, if they should be considered polytheists or monotheists or something in between. As there's this discussion. So most scholars say that, of course, they are accepted. They are, if they pay the tax, they can exist. But theologically, they usually say that they are polytheists. And I suppose Jews were saying the same about Christians. And if you think about also Christian, medieval Christian Europe, I mean, they were telling the craziest ideas about Islam. And they were oftentimes depicting the Muslims as worshipping Muhammad. So, and therefore polytheists, right? So that was part and parcel of their interreligious polemics against Muslims. So it's possible to always claim that your own understanding of the one God is the only right one and the others are mistaken. Gladly, of course, there have been also people who have said that there are also good things about in various traditions, and we should coexist peacefully. But both sides of the coins have existed, right?
As someone who really focuses on epigraphic evidence, many scholars have different specialties. You're not only looking at the epigraphic, you're looking at the textual, you're looking at the tradition of Islam, but you're also looking at pre-Islamic Arabia poetry, prose, and of course the Quranic material, hadith and such that come later, and pre-Islamic, any material that we have, as well as epigraphic inscriptions. Is it however you want to answer this, is it your opinion based on everything you see on stone and pre-Islamic Arabia from the poetry to the prose, you name it. Does that really make you want more modern scholars to question what they accept in the tradition of Islam? And I'm not talking about modern Muslim scholars. Of course, if you're Muslim and it's your tradition, oftentimes, they're going to be guilty of accepting tradition because Christians do it, Jews do it, you name it. But I'm talking modern critical secular scholarship. How do you look at it? What's more important first, epigraphic, and then the literary? Trying to look at both. And what are your thoughts about modern secular critical scholars and what they should do differently?
Yeah, that's a great point, and really, I mean, boils down to the questions of methodology. So, sort of, how do you approach history and historical evidence, and how do you then go about reconstructing historical developments, for instance?
If I may add one piece as to why, and I don't want to throw you off for the viewer, I struggle, ladies and gentlemen, when I read a text, I know it's a writing. And if you pause before you read and accept, sometimes people who write stuff are writing something that is purposefully not real. What is their real motivation? What are they really saying? And did this really happen? You can't just blindly accept and read everything you read and go, yep, it says it happened. We know that's not true in so many cases. And so I struggle, Ilkka, I struggle a lot on knowing whether or not this is history at all, or if this is completely fictive, specifically talking about the Gospels. So sorry to interrupt. I just want to make that clear.
No. And the great thing about studying the rise of Islam in contrast to the rise of Christianity is that we have this wealth of epigraphic evidence written on stone. We don't really have that in the case of Christianity. I mean, the first Christian inscriptions are from around the year 200 Common Era, if I'm not mistaken, so quite late. But with Islam, we actually have very early Arabic inscriptions written by people who were contemporary with the Prophet Muhammad. And then we have pre-Islamic inscriptions, which is something that more and more evidence of various pre-Islamic inscriptions are now sort of surfacing, and the scholars have found them and they're being published, etc., etc. So I was trained to, when it comes to the study of history, I was trained to look at contemporary evidence and also foreground material evidence. And this is why inscriptions are so important. I mean, in many cases, you can actually date them, or they are dated by their writers. And at least we haven't, yet encountered any fakes related, sort of epigraphic fakes related to the rise of Islam. There's not yet, at least, a market for such fakes. If this was biblical history, I mean, there are fakes related, fake inscriptions related to biblical history, and they have, sold for millions, I suppose. But then, concerning the rise of Islam, there's not yet, at least, the market for that. So fakes have not been forged. So it's authentic material. It's been found, for the most part at least, by scholars doing field work in the region, published in academic publications, and the inscriptions are still there. They are not taken. In most cases, they are on rock walls. You can't really take it to a museum. They just stays intact there, and hopefully nobody will vandalize it. I mean, they have, they have weathered centuries, so hopefully they will, survive a few more. Even though, of course, modern construction is something that is problematic for this sort of material, because it will, wipe out important evidence if you build concrete building on top of that. Okay, so contemporary evidence, material evidence, and Arabia, there's a lot of it and a lot to be discovered. So it's a very interesting field to be part of. Then in addition, I think historians should look at various other types of evidence as well. But somehow in their mind or in their prose, rank them in some way. I mean, like I said, contemporary evidence always comes first. Then, later evidence, not so important, but might be important and might include some vestiges of authentic information from even 2 centuries before it was written down, I suppose. But then you really have to argue that it includes authentic information. And then we have the Quran, which, at least to me and many other scholars, is contemporary to the Prophet Muhammad. And then we have poetry, we have non-Arabic sources. So we actually have quite a lot of and various types of evidence that we can use to discuss the rise of Islam. And like I mentioned, I mean, it's not the case that important new literary sources will come to light, probably, but new inscriptions will. And so everything that we have discussed might be modified in some point in the future, but that's also the exciting thing about the field.
Okay, so I guess my final question in that vein, and then we'll wrap this up because I want to do this again. There's so much you've found, epigraphic evidence and cool inscriptions and stuff that we could cover. What is the current debate? One of the biggest debates that you're in right now with academics in your field. Is there pushback or a common myth that people keep saying and you are actually fighting against and hoping to change their mind?
I mean, the idea of the penetration of the monotheist beliefs in pre-Islamic Arabia is perhaps something that is, to some extent at least, debated. I would say that quite a few have in recent years accepted the idea that there were quite a few Jews and Christians around, but then sort of especially the more particular geographical information is debated, like, for instance, how much there were Jews and Christians in Mecca or Medina. That's something that is quite a lot. There's a lot of dispute in that question. I mean, you have someone like Stephen Shoemaker who says that there were no Christians in Mecca or Medina, or next to none. So he calls Central Hijaz a Christ-barren region, and so that's quite common way of talking about Mecca and Medina, to say that, well, maybe Judaism and Christianity were spreading, or Christianity was spreading in various parts of the peninsula, but they were next to no Christians in Mecca or Medina. Granted, there are many scholars who acknowledge the idea that there were many Jews, or at least some Jews in Medina, but of course there also we can discuss the extent of the Jewish presence in Mecca as well, which is something that not many scholars have discussed. So that is something that people are sort of debating. But it is true that these old myths of polytheistic Arabia it's so strong that even people who then read the works of myself or somebody like Ahmed Al-Jallad, who has worked a lot on this material, published a lot of important stuff. So even if they read the works and may agree when they're reading, they sort of forget then when they're writing their own work. So I suppose that's also something that happened in Michael Cook's case, because he is familiar with recent epigraphic work related to late antique Arabia, but then somehow it just pushes through his prose so strongly the old long-lasting myth of polytheistic Arabia.
I really appreciate you so much for your time and teaching us. Everyone go into the description, check out the book, get the book. It's PDF for free, public access. And then you can go and follow him on academia. I hope you will. Is there any final words you'd like to say to our audience before we let you go, Dr. Lindstedt?
No, I'm just very happy to be here. Well, thanks for the invitation, and I'll be back.
Thank you. Yes, I look forward to having you back. We love learning this stuff. We appreciate everything that you do in the audience as well. Let us know your comments about what you learned today. I'm sure that Dr. Lindstedt would be interested to see what you have to say. Share this out. Let others see it, hear it. Let's get this information out there. Like the video, of course, and check out the links in the description. You can also support us down there. Thank you so much, ladies and gentlemen. And never forget, we are MythVision.